Thank you for downloading from the BBC. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
A Friday morning with Christmas looming, and at Sandy Hook Elementary School, the children were gathering in their classrooms when the shooting began.
I saw some of the bullets going past the hall that I was right next to, and then a teacher pulled me into her classroom.
We heard shots and everybody went on the ground.
The majority of those who died today were children. Beautiful little kids between the ages of 5 and 10 years old. They had their entire lives ahead of them. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, kids of their own.
BBC World Service. I'm Mike Williams with the Y Factor. On December the 14th, 2012, at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, 20 children and 6 members of staff were shot dead. The killer, Adam Lanza, also murdered his mother and went on to kill himself. However, some people, like Jim Fetzer, believe it never actually happened. This week, conspiracy theories.
Elaborate hoax. Nobody died there. It was done to promote Obama's gun control agenda. It's really shocking that it was an act of feigned terrorism.
There are 4 major characteristics to most conspiracy theories.
Joseph Uszynski is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Miami, and he's the author of a book called American Conspiracy Theories.
The first one is that there's a small group of people. The second is that that group of people is operating in secret and outside of public view. The third is that they're doing something that's going to benefit them in some way. So maybe it's that they're going to make an unseemly amount of profit, or swindle people out of money, or usurp political power, or change our institutions. And the final characteristic is that that plan that the conspirators partake in is going to be to the detriment of the common good. So a conspiracy theory wouldn't be, well, there's a group of doctors working in secret who are going to cure cancer for all mankind and we'll all be happier. That's not what I would include in a conspiracy theory. Generally, it would be there's a group of people working in secret to give us cancer and then to reap unseemly benefits from selling us the chemotherapy.
I think there's a misconception that conspiracy theories are kind of a curiosity that's limited to a paranoid fringe, a small group of people who have these strange ideas.
Dr. Rob Brotherton is a psychologist and science writer. He's author of the book Suspicious Minds, Why We Believe Conspiracy Theories.
And I think that's not true. That's a misconception. In fact, what the surveys show is that conspiracy theories are surprisingly widespread. So surprising numbers of people endorse various conspiracy theories. And what the psychological research that I discuss in the book shows is that in many ways conspiracy theories seem to be wired into our brains. Our brains have evolved to respond to certain claims in certain ways, and conspiracy theories resonate with the ways that our minds work. So, for example, one bias that we all have wired into our brains is something I call the intentionality bias. And what this is essentially when we're born, when we're children, our brains are designed to assume that everything happened on purpose, that somebody intended to do it. And so if you have a young child beneath the age of about 4, if you ask them why did somebody sneeze or why did they trip over on the street, there's a good chance that the child would tell you, well, they must have meant to do it. Maybe they enjoy sneezing or they like tripping over or something like that. And of course, as we get older, we learn that people don't always intend to do everything that they do. And so we become able to override this assumption, this bias that's built into our brain. But what the research shows is that it stays with us even into adulthood. And so when somebody has diminished cognitive resources, basically when they're busy thinking about something else, or after we've consumed some alcohol, then we become more likely to revert back to this bias and to assume everything was intended. And so this bias, conspiracy theories in particular, resonate with this bias because they paint everything that happens in the world as a result of the conspirators' intentions. Everything was planned by the conspirators. Nothing happens by accident. And so the research shows that the more susceptible a person is to this intentionality bias, the more likely they are to buy into conspiracy theories.
Are you content with the description conspiracy theorist?
Well, the fact is that the CIA wanted a label that could be used to discount critics by implying that if they didn't know every detail and couldn't answer every question, then they shouldn't be taken seriously.
Jim Fetzer is retired now. He got his first degree at Princeton University in the USA and, after serving with the Marines, achieved his PhD in the history and philosophy of science at Indiana University. For the next 35 years, he taught at a number of colleges across America.
I'd had a long-term interest in JFK. I was anchored out in Kaohsiung Harbor when he was assassinated.
Just a moment. We have a bulletin coming in. We now switch you directly to Parkland Hospital and KBOX News Director Bill Hampton.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
The executive officer of the mortar battery, of which I was the fire direction officer, awakened me at 3:30 in the morning to tell me he'd been shot. And then an hour later to tell me they'd caught the fellow who'd done it and he was a communist. I thought that was pretty fast work. When I returned to the United States, I began following the case and reading important books about the subject. It occurred to me that perhaps some of us with special backgrounds and abilities ought to become involved.
What special backgrounds, special abilities?
Well, for example, I taught logic, critical thinking, and scientific reasoning for 35 years, and I'm an expert on scientific reasoning, on the relationship between hypotheses and evidence, the nature of theories, explanations, and the like, which means that I have a analytical background and a conceptual framework that can apply to cases like this to take rumor and speculation out of the study of conspiracies and place them on a firm scientific foundation.
One study from 1995 that looked at this kind of confirmation bias in the context of conspiracy theories about the JFK assassination. What the experiment involved was taking people who initially had a hunch that there was a conspiracy behind the assassination, and another group of people who initially had a hunch that it wasn't a conspiracy. Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. And then everybody read the same packet of information. There were some bits of evidence that seemed consistent with the conspiracy theories, some that weren't consistent. Everybody read the same information. And what you would expect if people were being purely reasonable and basing their beliefs on the evidence is that their initial hunch should have diminished. Everybody should have converged in the middle because this evidence was deliberately made to be ambiguous. But in fact, what happened is people diverged in the direction of their initial belief. So people who started believing it was a conspiracy became more convinced of that. And on the other hand, people who started disbelieving the conspiracy theories became more convinced of that. Everybody was suffering from this confirmation bias. It was just pushing the different groups of people in different directions.
Some people will want to disbelieve any official narrative, but most people are picky and choosy when it comes to which narratives they're going to believe in and which ones they won't. So a lot of people have what I would call a conspiracy theory mentality. You know, some have it to a great degree, like any conspiracy theory that comes across their desk, they're going to believe in it.
Could I just get one or two word answers just to try to work out where you sit on some of these more controversial issues?
Sure.
9/11, attack on the World Trade Center, attack on the Pentagon.
Compliments of the CIA, the neocons, and the Department of Defense and the Mossad.
Okay. The European Holocaust of the Jews.
Well, it's very interesting, but those were labor camps.
Treblinka in Poland was dedicated to extermination. Between 1942 and 1943, around 870,000 Jews were killed there. Samuel Willenberg, who's now 87, says most people were sent straight to the gas chambers.
We have all kinds of scientific and other evidence. There were 236 references to 6 million Jews in dire straits or in fear of loss of their lives prior to the Nuremberg tribunals beginning in 1890. The International Committee of the Red Cross was going to all the camps, keeping meticulous records about how many died. They adjusted their figures in 1993. Their total was 296,081, none of whom died from being put to death by gassing in a chamber.
Some people have it to a lesser degree. they might believe some conspiracy theories if they have a lot of evidence or if they comport with their other values. So, for instance, Glenn Beck is a good one. Glenn Beck is a very popular radio show host here in the United States, and he has a reputation as being a conspiracy theorist. I mean, he connects a lot of dots and says that there's a grand communist conspiracy going on that involves the president and many other players. But even given that almost all of his shows involve some sort of conspiracy theory, he says that the birther theory, the idea that Barack Obama was born in Kenya or somewhere else outside of the United States, is completely bogus. So people pick and choose what they want to believe in, but there is a tendency out there that some people have more or less to buy into conspiratorial logic.
The moon landings, the Apollo moon landings.
It wasn't scientifically possible to make the trip, but for political propaganda purposes, the United States wanted to appear to be ahead of the Soviet Union, where we had been shocked by the launching of Sputnik, for which we were unprepared.
So you think they were faked as well?
They were fake.
There's been a lot said about conspiracy theories over time, but the problem is that most claims about them haven't been backed up with data. So when I got into this project 5 years ago, I looked around to see what kind of survey data was available. What I did was to go essentially back in time. We went back to 1890 and started reading letters to the editor of the New York Times. So we read about 120,000 letters. And we picked out the ones that talked about some sort of conspiracy going on. So these ranged from, accusing American presidents, accusing political parties, accusing corporations, accusing religious groups. Pretty much everyone that could be accused was accused of conspiring. So when George Bush was president, 9/11 happens and he becomes incredibly powerful or incredibly popular, starts passing a lot of legislation to deal with the terror threat and then going to war with Afghanistan and Iraq. And the pushback against that was in part conspiracy theories. It was, did Bush do 9/11? Was Bush behind this in some way? Is Bush going to war for oil? Is he going to war to give profits to Halliburton? You see this flip on its head 8 years later when Obama comes to office. Was Obama secretly usurping power unconstitutionally? Was he really born in Indonesia or Kenya? Was he behind the Deepwater Horizon oil spill? Was he behind the Sandy Hook shootings? Did he want to take away guns or, illegally put in place some sort of green energy policy through some sort of conspiracy? So what we find over time, and this goes back as far as our data goes, is that who's ever in power is the one that gets accused of it. And it's the people who are out of power are the ones who are doing the accusing.
You've upset an awful lot of people. It doesn't matter what I personally believe. People are free to read the accounts of the witnesses in the school, the police officers who took part, the medics who treated the wounded, the medical examiners who handled the bodies.
You're misinformed.
People are free to read those accounts and also to listen to the testimony of the parents who buried 20 children from 6 and 7 years old. And you say it didn't happen.
You're begging the question, Mike. I'm sorry to say you don't know what you're talking about. You've never investigated it. The school was closed by 2008. There were no children there for Adam Lanza to have shot. This is a huge scam.
It does put governments and officials in a tricky position. For example, if you think about the death of Osama bin Laden, the raid in which the US government killed bin Laden and disposed of his body at sea, there were people at the time who said, well, maybe this is a conspiracy, maybe this didn't really happen because we haven't seen any evidence. Why won't the government just put out some pictures of bin Laden's body and that would put all these rumors to rest? And the government didn't because they said, the pictures could just incite people against the government. And I think it was a wise decision. I think if the government had have put out pictures of the corpse to satisfy the conspiracy theorists, well, I don't think it would have worked. I think the conspiracy theorists would have just looked at the pictures, they would have pored over them looking for any detail, any anomaly, and they would have found something which would allow them to write it off as a fake, to say that the pictures had just been concocted, that they were all part of the plot as well.
There's this famous photograph that appears to be a policewoman escorting children away from Sandy Hook, taken by Shannon Hicks, who was the associate editor and photographer for the Newtown Bee. But there's a second photograph that actually appears to have been taken earlier, where you can see a whole string of parents there looking on with their arms crossed. You look carefully, it turns out when you compare the two photographs, they rearranged the children to get a better shot. And what in the world were parents doing there if this had been bona fide? Do you think someone during this mass shooting would have got on the phone and said, we got to get some parents down here? This was an elaborate hoax.
Do you understand how upsetting this is to the victims, to the survivors, to the parents?
It isn't. They made lots of money. Over $27 million was donated. Do you realize that they were so confused about the dates because the rehearsal was on the 13th that many put up donation sites already on the 13th? That even Ed Alonzo's original date of death was recorded the 13th, making his feat and shooting 20 children and 6 adults the following day all the more remarkable. Not only have these families benefited from a minimum of $1 million apiece in donations from sympathetic but gullible Americans.
Do you think that I'm deluded in believing the accounts of the police, the medics, the medical examiners who examined the bodies, and having seen the parents at the funerals burying these, I assume you consider to be empty coffins? Do you think that I am deluded?
You're mistaken because you haven't done any research. I mean, look, man, a former Marine Corps officer and 35 years as a college professor. Since my retirement in 2006, I've been devoting myself for the rest of my life to exposing these hoaxes and deceptions by the American government. They are far more prevalent in terms of politically significant events than you would imagine. For example,
why have you devoted your life, your subsequent life to it? Why?
Well, philosophers are dedicated to truth. Philosophers of science know that science is the most reliable way to determine the truth. And as a former Marine Corps officer, I care about the future of my country.
I see these names on the screen in front of me. Charlotte Bacon, 6. Daniel Barden, 7. Olivia Engel, 6 years old. Josephine Gay, Dylan Hockley, Madeleine Sue, Catherine Hubbard. The list goes on. Are you saying that these people just never existed?
No, they may have existed, but I'm saying they didn't die because nobody died at Sandy Hook. So if you don't know the details, you can easily be taken in. And I'm sorry that a very large segment of the public has been taken in, which is why we as conspiracy analysts who are doing conspiracy research are devoting ourselves to bringing the truth to the people because we believe they are entitled to know the truth about their own history.
And so again, it ties into this logic where there's really no way to disprove a conspiracy theory. Once people are invested in it, once they believe in it, there's not much you can do. There's not much evidence you can provide to change people's minds.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.